Sir David was taken from us in a contemptible act of violence, striking at the core of what it is to be a member of this House and violating the sanctity both of the church in which he was killed and the constituency surgery that is so essential to our representative democracy.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. There has been only one major story in the United Kingdom this past week. The shocking, brutal murder of a British member of Parliament who was stabbed multiple times by an Islamic extremist. Sir David Amess was attacked in a church where he was meeting with constituents by a man who was a British national of Somali heritage. The attacker set up an appointment to see Amess. He traveled 50 miles to carry out the killing. Radicalized, it would appear, from watching videos on the internet, although the full story will emerge as anti-terror police carry out a detailed investigation, including of his social media and associates. The man is under arrest, in custody, since the day of the terror attack. But there is a lot to this story. And on this backstory, we try to walk you through it all. All right, joining me now here in Britain is Jo Phillips, who's a regular political commentator and appears on all the different television networks here. Hi, Jo.
Hi, Dana. Good to be with you.
Would you agree? I mean, this killing has really shaken the political establishment here.
Oh, absolutely. It was completely out of the blue. David Amess, the MP who was murdered in his constituency surgery, was a backbench MP. He didn't hold ministerial office. He didn't have a high profile except locally. He hadn't said or done anything, as far as we can tell, to make any enemies or anything controversial. I mean, it is an absolute shock. But of course, it comes within 5 years of the murder of Jo Cox, another MP who was murdered.
So Jo Cox was working for the Labour Party, had been very outspoken against Britain leaving the European Union. And then she was attacked, same kind of situation, outside a constituency meeting, stabbed and shot. And once again, everybody said, we can never allow this to happen. And we really have to have lessons learned, from increasing security of MPs to, whatever else was widely discussed and probably not implemented very well.
Well, I think since the murder of Jo Cox, there has been a ramping up, if you like, of the security for MPs. I mean, once upon a time, you only had any sort of police protection or panic buttons or anything like that if you were working in a ministry or you were associated with something like Northern Ireland, for instance. Now it is fairly commonplace for MPs to have a little bit more of a security background, if you like. But the reality is that these are local people who are elected locally. They need to be seen. They need to be seen by the people who voted for them. And even if you said, right, no more face-to-face meetings in constituency surgeries, which is where people go to deal with housing problems, welfare problems, any number of issues. How are you going to never go to the shops? Are you never going to open that school fete? Are you never going to attend a prize giving or a sports match? I mean, you can't make locally elected politicians just not be visible, because that's not democracy.
Right. Okay. But, it may not have, we will learn more and more about this. And in fairness to you and anybody else, I mean, we are still only learning the kind of the initial details of who the man was that attacked him, that carried out this terrorist attack. But there were threats, and there were apparently a number of threats that the member of parliament had received. So it really isn't just out of the blue, is it?
Well, we don't know that those threats came from this particular person. And certainly most MPs and anybody actually in public life, particularly in political public life, will tell you that they get threats on a daily basis.
That's the problem right then and there, isn't it? I mean, they have so many threats.
Yeah.
Apparently, they just don't even know how to weed through any of that and understand what should be taken seriously and what's just another angry person out there posting on social media.
Well, and social media is blamed for many, many things. I think the biggest blame you can lay at its door in this instance is that because social media is anonymous, or it anonymizes the person who is sending the threat, very often it's almost impossible for anybody to track it down without a very complex and time and costly use of police resources to backtrack to the person who sent that angry tweet at 3:00 in the morning. I mean, once upon a time, as you know, Dana, you'd get a letter from somebody, it was on lined paper in green ink and everything was heavily underlined, and you'd put it on the deal with it later pile. You get something on email, that doesn't have anything to flag it up. There was an MP who is the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, senior Labour MP, a woman, Yvette Cooper, whose former office manager was talking the other day about 900 threats a week.
900.
900. And these are death threats.
Incredible.
I mean, I think the other thing that you have to bear in mind is it's not just the MP, it is their staff, who are often certainly low paid and quite often volunteers in the constituency. So it's the staff who've got to deal with that. And it's also their families. People's children have been targeted, people's spouses have been targeted. And there is this appalling sort of, if you're in public life, you've got to take what's going to get aimed at you, regardless of how horrific it is, which is completely wrong.
Yeah, and I think some of the other concern is that police are warning that during the lockdown, endless hours have been spent by people, trolling through material that probably shouldn't be on the internet at all. And very well, maybe in this case, that this man became radicalized during the pandemic lockdowns.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, it's perfectly possible, particularly, young people who are without any focus or something. They can't go to work, they can't go to college, they can't see their friends, they can't do any of the normal things. Yes, they're sitting in their bedrooms or wherever they are, and they're on the net and the dark web trawling for all sorts of stuff. I mean, we don't know. We still don't know any reason why this particular.
It's not the dark web, though. I mean, this stuff is readily
it's out there, absolutely
available. Yeah. And as we saw from this whistleblower who testified against Facebook, in fact, the algorithm of Facebook and Instagram really gets traction and brings profit by highlighting conflict and bringing that back to people. Yes. So the internet companies are just not guilty of allowing this out there, and not only guilty of not removing it, but they are, according to the whistleblower, guilty of allowing the algorithm to push conflict and negative messages to people, so they get more and more and more of it.
Absolutely. And so you disappear down this rabbit hole, if you like, this echo chamber, where it reinforces everything that you've been looking at. I mean, you and I both know as journalists, you can look up something, you can check something out, and within minutes you're bombarded with information and suggestions, if you like, of a further reading on this subject. Well, one would hope that you and I know better than that. But of course, if you're vulnerable, you're susceptible, you're going to go down this and further into that route. So yes, the internet companies have an enormous number of questions to, they cannot hide behind the fact that they are not publishers. They are publishing stuff, and they're putting it out there through technology, through algorithms, and they're making a lot of money out of it. But the other thing is that, this isn't just something in the ether of the internet. This is about behaviour in public life. Anyone who has been in the House of Commons and has watched Prime Minister's Question Time or seen it on the television will know that it is a screaming bear pit. When I used to work in the Commons many years ago, the person I worked for, Paddy Ashdown, leader of the Liberal Democrats, he was quite often physically sick before he did Question Time. And it is a real pressure on people. And we have this. He
was physically sick because of the pressure of having to
and knowing
joust with the
and knowing that
power.
as a third party that, you might get called, you might not get called, but you were going to be booed, you were going to be hissed at. I mean, I remember him once wearing a red ribbon for National AIDS Day, and the abuse and the homophobic insults that were screamed across the Commons chamber were absolutely shocking. Now, our politicians, of whom David Amess was one and Jo Cox was one, they are, by and large, I believe people go into politics for the right reasons. They want to do something good. They want to serve their constituents. But the behaviour of people, particularly at the top of the political tree, and the language that's used, I mean, you mentioned Jo Cox and Brexit. It's not that long ago, Dana, that the Prime Minister, as he is now, and his ministers and his cronies were talking about people who didn't want to leave the European Union in the most pejorative terms.
Yeah, they use terms like capitulation. They're traitors. They accuse them of surrender. The surrender bill, I think it was called. But I mean, the case of Jo Cox, for people that are not in Britain, need to understand that was an ultra nationalist who was pro-Brexit and saw her fighting the departure from the European Union, and saw her maybe in those terms that the Tory party, the Conservative Party, had used, that she was a traitor, and he attacked her, and he is now serving life in prison. This attack is by an Islamic extremist, it would appear, given what we've been told so far, who was radicalized on the internet. And there were very few parallels in terms of, yes, the messaging is horrible in both cases, but the motivation is probably very different.
Oh, completely. And I mean, we still don't know, and we may never know, whether the fact that this young man who is of Somali heritage, and in fact, his father used to work for this previous Somali prime minister, whether there was some link to Al-Shabaab or something like that he got involved with.
Or ISIS or Al-Qaeda or...
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, the awful tragedy of both these cases is that on the one hand, you've got Jo Cox, who was a Labour MP. So in American terms, she was a Democrat. You've got David Amess, who was wanted to leave Europe, was anti-abortion, anti-hunting. So you could say in a sort of a right wing, I suppose, if you like, of the Conservative Party, although not extreme. But, you've also got the deputy leader of the Labour Party only 3 weeks ago at their party conference talking about Tory scum. So, this...
And she was asked to apologise and declined to do so.
Yes. And, so I'm afraid, when she put out a tweet after David Amess was murdered, saying, our hearts go, it rings a little hollow. Many of the speeches that we've heard, and the Commons does come into its own, and people do make good speeches, and it becomes very somber. But they do ring very hollow, because how many weeks before they're back to shouting and yelling and Yabu sucks across the dispatch box? Yeah. And what people say, outside, we see it and hear it all the time. People need to, particularly people in public life, they need to set an example. You might think that. Yeah. Don't say it.
That's all well and good, and I agree with you. But I mean, look what's happening in the United States right now, and governors who have been targets of murder plots because of the language used by the Republicans against the Democrats. And none of that's gone away. I mean, we seem to be in a cycle that is, if you want to draw a parallel with an airplane in a spin, I mean, the downward plunge is tightening, and the garbage and the public discourse is getting worse. And maybe there's a breath for a moment and a pause when these horrible incidents happen. Like the murder of this member of parliament, but then, by next week or the week after, everybody's back to where they were.
It was only a few months ago that everybody was standing outside on their doorsteps in the UK on a Thursday night, banging saucepans and clapping hands and painting, chalking rainbows on their walls and things, praising the frontline medical staff, the police, the ambulance crews, the nurses, the refuse collectors, all of those things. Now, we're back to some sort of normality, and that normality has brought with it not any lasting respect for those frontline workers, but abuse to people, doctors, receptionists, abuse to people on frontline medical care. And also you see it in the protests that have been happening in the UK recently of this group, Insulate Britain, this environmental protest where they've blocked roads. Now, whether or not people have the right to protest and whether or not they have the right to inconvenience an awful lot of other people is for a whole different subject. But the anger and the vitriol on both sides, whether you're a person stuck in the queue on the M25 driving your car at these people who've glued themselves to the road, or whether you're the people who think it's absolutely fine to stop people getting to hospital and to barricade. We seem to have lost any moral compass.
Well, certainly the internet has fed a lot of this, right? And public discourse just generally and social media is, by the very nature of it, just ugly. It's just ugly and competitive. But look, there are some concrete things here. In terms of anonymity, should we, given the depth and breadth of a tsunami of vicious calls to violence on the internet, should the anonymity be removed?
Oh, I think so. If you were the editor of a paper, if you were running a phone-in program on a radio show or a TV show or something, you would not take somebody unless they gave their name. You might not use it, and you can say name and address withheld for a variety of reasons, but you would not take something that's anonymous, and that should apply to the internet. People cannot any longer hide behind this and these sort of ridiculous, silly names that they have for themselves. So anonymity has to be removed. Right. There has to be a culpability.
And by the way, the argument against removing anonymity has been in countries where, you have not a democracy, but where people struggle to be able to have some sort of democratic debate, and they have to hide, otherwise they could be arrested. But that doesn't apply
But that doesn't apply to somebody no. And there's a whole difference between somebody living in a regime like Myanmar or Russia or Syria to somebody who just is vile and is going to make death threats against an MP.
Should we, and Europe has talked more than America about it, begin to hold social media companies to account? If
Absolutely.
This man was radicalized on the internet through material that was allowed to stay on there, even though there were calls to violence, or at least sometimes they skate and they ballet through some of this because they know they could be charged for inciting violence. So rather than call for an attack, they might call for membership in an illegal organization or membership in, Al Qaeda or ISIS or that kind of thing. Should media companies now find themselves receiving very serious fines if they do not remove the material?
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't just stop at this sort of thing. It begins and ends tragically for what it does to children. And that was one of the things that came out of the whistleblowers' testament to the Senate committee, is what Facebook is quite happy to let go on, where it is deliberately targeting and enticing young people, many of whom end up self-harming, doing daft things, in the worst case, killing themselves. So yes, the social media companies have got to be responsible, and fines, unfortunately, are the only thing they recognize because money is all they care about.
Yeah, and I don't know why we've been so slow to do it. And everybody keeps saying it's impossible to do it. But in fact, I think here in the UK, they're talking about bringing forward a bill that would hold social media companies to account, and also in other parts of the European Union.
Yeah, and if the online harms bill, which is making its way slowly through Parliament at the moment, if it actually does become law, it will not be without problems. It's a very, very clumsy mechanism because it gives Ofcom, the governing authority, if you like, for broadcast, power to regulate social media. But it does mean that they will be dealing with stuff that has been or originates in a different country under a different jurisdiction. But, just in the same way as broadcast is governed by Ofcom.
Will they be able to do that, by the way?
Well, I don't know. I should imagine there are some lawyers licking their lips and cranking open their safety deposit boxes to work out the cases that they will take on, saying, you can't do this. Because, if you put it the other way around, Russia, which has just expelled one of the BBC's long-term correspondents, Sarah Rainsford, or Syria, or, name any country you like, that will not allow publication and things. Do we want to go down that route? No, we don't. But I think there is a point where actually this is causing too much harm and too much damage.
Last thing I want to ask you about is that the man who is now in custody, the 25-year-old who stabbed a member of parliament here 17 times. It's a horrendous attack, really. He had been in a program to de-radicalize him somehow. And he is not the first man who has carried out terror attacks in England. There have been at least 2 others, including Manchester, including the London Bridge, where those attackers had been in the same program. I mean, is that not a complete and utter failure of some program that was set up to de-radicalize?
Well, who knows? Because the program you refer to is called Prevent. We only know about the failures. We don't know about the successes by its very nature. It's a little bit like, when the anti-terror police or MI5 say to you, well, we've managed to stop 100 terrorist incidents. Well, we don't know that. We've only got their word. We don't know how many people have been sort of saved, if you like, from
why is it a secret? Why are the details of it so murky and foggy, and they don't want to spell out what the program does? Or
no, and
in fact, people are calling for a review of it right now.
Yeah, anyway. It does need a review, and partly because it is so heavily skewed towards Islamic fundamentalism that it is seen as very, very discriminatory against Muslims. And I think that their concerns are completely justified. Now, people who are supportive say, oh, no, it does deal with the far right and the sort of the nationalists and all the rest of it, which, yes, it does to a certain extent. But it's much easier to spot somebody, who's got a long beard or wearing different clothes or something, and you're a nosy neighbour and you go, oh, I think he's a terrorist. I don't like the way they behave. It's full of all sorts of things, but I think none of these things is perfect. We do inevitably end up using sledgehammers to try and crack nuts. We need to.
But Jo, I would really hope they come up with a sledgehammer in this case, because
absolutely,
horrible, tragic deaths in a period of 5 years in very similar circumstance. That can't happen again.
No,
that can't happen.
It can't happen, and. It will make people think twice about whether they want to go into public life. And, in all the eulogies and the tributes to David Amess, what has come across more than anything, that he was absolutely dedicated for decades to his constituency and his constituents. Now, people like that are valuable. What they do is to provide public service above and beyond. And as I said before, it's not just them, it's their families. There will be events that his children were involved with that he couldn't go to because he was doing a constituency event or he was voting in the Commons. There will have been wedding anniversaries, family holidays, and things that he's missed because he was dealing with the constituency issue. We've got to stop calling politicians, bad, because most of them are not. We know that power corrupts. And we know that there are some people who are questionable in their pursuit of power and the way they administer the power that they then gain. But most
they've got to stop calling each other bad. Although let's be realistic. You're going to criticize somebody's performance.
I know, but
as a power broker, as somebody who is ruling, as somebody who's making decisions, and they deserve what they get as long as it's not a flirtation with a call to arms.
And don't make it personal. Don't make it a call to violence. Don't make it threatening. I mean, to a certain extent, it's a long way from perfect. But if you look at the change on the football, in the football stadiums of Britain, they are
even if you, now that you're raising that, right, that by itself is an affront to everything that most people believe in, where whether it's online, and a lot of it's online, or whether it's in the stands when they're calling out players, throwing banana peels at them, making all sorts of horrid racist remarks. And that has been allowed to go on for a long time.
Yeah. So, why every now and again somebody's banned for life, every now and again a football club is fined. But actually, the only way you stop that is, I'm afraid it's a bit like being a school teacher. It's like the whole class has to stay behind until we sort this out, because it's the peer pressure, isn't it? And it's, there are so many things here that if somebody's shouting or behaving badly or something like that, you would call them out and say, hang on a minute, just calm down. The problem, to go back to the whole thing of social media, so much of it is done in solitary. So there is nobody to double check you. There is nobody to say, are you sure you want to send that? Hang on a minute, don't shout. He didn't mean it. Calm down. There's no control. And if you don't have that sort of boundary, that self-boundary, if you like, then this behaviour will go on. But we have to look to our politicians and people in public life, actually, to behave better, to set a better example, and to call out their colleagues when they don't.
Given what's happened to David Amess, though, I would say that as an MP, I would not, or an advisor to an MP, I would not suggest that they just go on tomorrow as business as usual and meet people randomly without trying to screen, without having some better protection than just inviting them, anybody and all, to meet one-on-one with the member of parliament who has no protection, no bodyguard, no stab vest, just absolutely nothing. I think there has to be an improvement in their security. There has to be an in-between, not meeting constituents and just meeting everyone who wants to come.
Well, it used to be, and probably still does exist as a right, that if you were a British subject, you could go to the House of Commons and you could demand to see your MP without an appointment. And, back in the day, people did quite often turn up and they'd sit there in central lobby and wait to see their appointment.
But you go through a metal detector now.
Now you do. And now you can't go, unless you've got an appointment. And my understanding certainly from the David Amess case is that the person who stabbed him had made an appointment, had phoned up, had spoken to somebody and had given a plausible reason that he was moving to the area and wanted to talk about health services or something, and then had got an appointment. So it's not just...
it seems like he wasn't randomly chosen. He was targeted.
Yeah. And who knows why?
And who knows why? And we're going to hear more.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Jo Phillips, thank you. And that's our backstory for this week. Please share the podcast link. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.